Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Generational Archives. Again, you are joining us for the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations and archival research. I'm Dr. Raina J. León, and I'm so happy that you are joining us again. I hope that you have been following us along the way. I'm here with my mother. We're part of a mother-daughter duo. Dr. Norma D. Thomas, how are you going to introduce yourself today, Mommy?
I'm just happy to be here today and happy to focus on our topic today.
I love that you're always happy to be here. I hope that you are never unhappy to be here, that we never have that instance. So that's great. I am also happy to be here. So today we are going to be talking about my grandmother, my father's mother, Juanita León, Juanita Adorno, Juanita Garcia. Names change. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But before we begin, let's start, or before we talk about my Juanita, which is how we both knew her, our check-in question. And that check-in question is this. Who taught you to pray? And what was that first prayer, Mommy?
Well, at first I couldn't think of what the first prayer was. I know who taught us how to pray, and that was my mother. It brought back memories of when we were little kids. We had to kneel at our bedside every night before we went to sleep. So the prayer was, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." And then I said to Raina, there's another verse, which is, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Please, angels, watch me through the night and keep me safe till morning light."
So for me, the person who taught me to pray that I recall, and the first prayer was exactly this prayer, especially that first portion of "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep." And I remember it being you. I remember, I don't know what was happening at the time, but I was going to go to sleep in your bed. This was at our old house in Philadelphia, in Southwest Philadelphia, and kneeling by the bed and you teaching me this prayer. And every line, you would have me repeat the line and then going to sleep. And I want to say that perhaps I was having nightmares or something like that, but whatever it was, I remember that moment specifically of sleeping in your bed and being taught this prayer. So I love that this prayer is generational too, this teaching of a mother to daughter and mother to daughter again. And it's the same prayer. It's even the same act of kneeling by the bed and praying. And I want to say that I kept that practice myself of kneeling by the bed to pray for a long time as a child, and just independently. And I don't know when that stopped for myself, but you had said that that was a daily practice for you as a child too.
Yeah, we did that for a while. I don't know when it stopped because obviously when we got older, we did not do that anymore. But I know all of us would be kneeling by that bedside and praying. And it reminds me of something maybe for a future episode, Raina, we should do the lullaby that my mother used to sing. And she sang to my niece and I sang to you. And sometimes I've sung it when your kids were little. So we'll add that to one of our future episodes as well.
Yeah, thinking about those generational passages of lullabies, of prayers, of recipes, all of that is important, and to document it with you all, but to foster the conversation of what has been passed down to you is something to be remembered. So let's transition into talking about my Juanita. So, Mommy, how would you describe my Juanita, which was how we knew my father's mother?
Well, I would describe her as being very family oriented. I would describe her as being very, very, very religious. You could put a lot of varies on that one. And I would describe her as being fierce because she was definitely a fierce lady.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No messing with my Juanita. She was like 4'10" and a force of nature. I when thinking about this piece around faith and prayer, that check-in question came from how faithful she was, how devoted to spirituality and religious practice she was. She would in the best days of her life and her healthiest days, she would go to church pretty much every day. And I did this interview with her in 2003, and she was talking about how she did have that practice of walking to church every day. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. They looked out for her, and they knew where she was going. She was going to church.
When you all were very little and she took care of you, I would have to come from Southwest Philly, and she would already be at St. Edmunds, so I would drop you off at St. Edmunds, and she never sat in the back. So she was always in the front. So I had to take these two kids with the stroller up to the front of the church, drop you off, and then go to work.
Well, and that piece of she was definitely a dedicated member of the church and involved us in going to church. So, we would go to church with her. I remember very clearly us going to St. John Newman once she moved to North Philly and being fascinated by the practice of receiving communion and being so upset that my older cousin, Juanita, also named Juanita, called Mita in our family, was able to take communion, and my brother and I were not, because we looked at it as if they were potato chips. And we were like, we want the potato chips too. And my Juanita was like, nah, that's not what that is. Not going to explain, a little bit too complicated for these little ones. But
and before I forget, when I married your dad, I was still a member of a Baptist church. I was a member of Bright Hope Baptist Church in the city, and neither of us thought much about getting married in the church. And if my mother was upset about anything, and if you could see our wedding pictures, her expression was not one of joy that we were married at the Justice of the Peace, but I applaud her that she came.
Yes.
But she was, again, this force of nature. So when you were born, she really wanted to get you baptized and convinced me that I needed to at least go through the classes at the church so that you could be baptized on Easter Sunday. And in the process, I became a member of this class, and both of us were baptized on Easter Sunday at St. Edmunds, and she was ecstatic.
Yeah, she was definitely a faith warrior and committed to making sure that all of her people were baptized within the Catholic Church. And so many, many years later, after my grandmother had transitioned, my husband and I got married in her church, the church that she had belonged to when she transitioned. And I definitely was very committed to that because I knew how much it meant to me, but also how much it would have meant to her to have been present for that wedding. And my husband was like, yo, we got married yesterday. Like we did the whole civil marriage. We had a big wedding reception. We had a great party, but I was very, very committed to us getting married in the Catholic Church the following day. So,
well, we also... me and your dad were married in the Catholic Church in, I want to say, 1990. So we did the whole godparents and got married in the church.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And even, all of this is really fascinating when thinking about my grandmother, because we learned later, after interviewing my Titi Vilma, that she herself did not get married in the Catholic Church until much later in her partnership with my grandfather, Danny Ning, in the 50s and in the 60s, right? Because you
in the 70s.
In the 70s, that's right.
It would have been if the interview with your aunt is correct.
That's right.
It seems to coincide when I first met her, which would have been in 1974. Mm-hmm. I was in Philadelphia. I had started graduate school. I met your father on a street corner in the Logan part of the city. And I was at the house down on Snyder Avenue, and I was upstairs. And all I remember is somebody saying, "Oh, my mother said you have to go downstairs."
Oh, no.
And this blonde woman walks in and looks at me in total, I don't even know what the expression was, that I was coming down her stairs. But based on the story of my sister-in-law, they were returning from, quote unquote, their honeymoon, having gotten married at Milagrosa, if I remember right.
That's right. That's right. And you saying, "Oh my goodness, I remember she was this bleach blonde, perceived as white woman coming into, or you meeting Papi's mother, my grandmother, for the first time. Like, oh, what was this?" And interviewing Titi Vilma the other day was, oh, why had she had this blonde
Where did she
hair?
come from?
Where was she
Where did
coming
she come from? And Velma talked about her having this blonde hair, and I said, that's when I met Mami Juanita.
Yeah, this is the process of like piecing together lives is so fascinating. And I think about, I went back to a recording that I did with Mami Juanita. So I happen to always be very interested in her story. So in 2003, I was in graduate school and did this interview as part of a project for Teachers College. It was around oral histories, and interviewed my grandmother for about 35, 40 minutes. And I had this recording on a micro cassette. Anybody who knows about recordings now knows that that technology is defunct. You cannot find a microcassette recorder for less than $250 now. So for years, I played like a little bit of it just to make sure that the recording hadn't deteriorated over time, and also just to hear my grandmother's voice. But the other day I was like, okay, we're doing this podcast. Let me go back to that recording and see if I can harvest it as I did with grandmom's recording, using a cassette and transferring it to MP3. So I go to the microcassette recorder, and y'all, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I've changed the batteries. I've checked the batteries. It's not working. And I don't have the connector, the plug for this microcassette. So I'm looking for replacements. They're over $250. It's a lot of money. So I order for less than $20 a new plug to go into the microcassette, and I pray that this thing is going to work, that it's just a battery compartment. And it is, luckily. So I find the right connector, plug it in, and there is my grandmother's voice. There is mine. It's really hushed. So I have to do all sorts of manipulations with sound to make sure that I can get a good enough sound to record it. But I do record it. And I sent it to a transcript provider that can do transcripts in Spanish, and because it's much faster than me, and pay the money. I used Go Transcript for anybody who's interested in transcripts in different languages, and did that. Got the transcript within like 2 days. And so now I have not only the audio, and I used Audio Master for those of you who are interested in the technology. I played the recording, recorded it with Audacity, made it a little bit louder with Audio Master, transferred that to Go Transcript to get the transcription. And now I have the written transcription as well as my grandmother's voice. And so I'll be pulling a little bit of that, her voice, to share with you all in this podcast at the end.
And one of the things I want to add is, if I'm remembering this correctly, is that one of the reasons that you really wanted to become fluent in Spanish was so that you could do interviewing and find out your grandmother's story. Right. Because my mother-in-law did not communicate very well in English. Yeah. She knew English. She used to try to talk to me in English all the time, and I would say, Juanita, talk to me in Spanish, because some of the I often could understand her better in Spanish than I could in English. And that's amazing that she could be in this country for such a long time, negotiate what she needed to negotiate, but primarily have to do it in Spanish.
So let's get to the facts of it. So according to her obituary, which I wrote and got approved by my aunts and uncles, she was born in February 8th, 1928. So her parents were Cándido and Ángela, also called Angelina, which is important because one of my cousins is named Angelina. And I had always thought that her mother was only known as Angelina. And in one of the interviews, she's like, no, her name was Angela, but everybody called her Angelina. And so she had many, many children, 8 children ultimately, 2 that she raised and 6 biological, 21 grandchildren that were listed within the obituary, and then well over 30 great-grandchildren at the time of her death. Super interesting that in that interview that I did in 2003, I went back to the transcript, and she actually said that she was born in 1924. But when I look at her birth certificate from Puerto Rico, which I was able to find on Ancestry.com, also on Family Search, it lists her birth date as the same day, but in 1923. So super interesting that this interview that I did in 2003, when she was 80, as I knew it, she herself identifies as being 79. So super interesting. Another piece that's interesting to me around the dates and information is that she says that she first came to New York from Puerto Rico on the Marine Tiger, as many people from Puerto Rico did take that boat ride to New York in 1946, and that it's in a ship manifesto. She's actually listed as taking that ship later. What's fascinating to me is that when she recounts the Marine Tiger, or what happened is that she went back to Puerto Rico, and then she came back again. And when she comes back, as she's in her interview, she's in her 80s in this interview, she remembers the month and almost the exact day of being on that ship. It's fascinating to me at 80 years old how insightful and attentive to detail she was. She remembers September 23rd as arriving in New York, and the ship manifesto says September 5th. Amazing to me for, over 40 years, over 50 years after the fact, and she still remembers the month that she came with her 1-year-old daughter, my aunt.
Could the 5th be when she got on the ship?
Could be when she got on the ship.
I hope it didn't take that long to get to New York, but you never know.
Exactly. Could have been that long, but that she remembers arriving on September 23rd, and then the ship manifesto that I've been able to find online, which you can find on Ancestry.com for those of you who are thinking about migration records. Oftentimes you can find ship manifestos as well as airplane passenger lists, not recent ones, but I think up until the 1960s or 70s, a lot of the passenger airplane lists are actually available on Ancestry.com too. So I also really celebrate that she, in the interview in 2003, recounted some of her old addresses, which is so important because if you know someone's address, you can find their listing in the census if they are listed there. So for those of you who are thinking about doing interviews with your people and trying to figure out their movements, finding out addresses that they remember from your aunts and uncles, your peoples, can help you to locate other information about them. So let's get into some other interesting features about my grandmother from the records. So birth certificate. I had never seen her birth certificate until, I want to say, what was it, Mommy? I mentioned it maybe a year ago or something.
Yeah, recently.
A year, 2 years ago. I think more recently, within the year. And Bobby had never seen it either. So I found it on Ancestry, and it notes her name. I had only ever known her as Mami Juanita. So, but of course, her actual name was Juana. I just never made that association because there were so many Juans in the family, and even one of her.
And it's always the Ita.
Yeah.
Ito gets added as the term of endearment, like you're Rainita. So.
Right. But I just always had made that association. So Juana is actually her name on her birth certificate, but it was Garcia. Where did that come from? Because I had always known that her father was an Adorno. Well, according to her birth certificate, she carried the name of her mother. It was common, and this was validated by my Titi Vilma, to cohabitate and perhaps not be married in the church or married officially. So after many, many years and many children and being together, her father ultimately recognizes her officially on her birth certificate. And that was fascinating to me too, is that the registrar notes when that actually happened. On the 24th of April in 1957, she is recognized officially by her father. And I wonder why. What happened in 1957 that made it necessary for that recognition to happen? But in the birth certificate, her new last name is literally written along the side of her name. His parents aren't noted there. That's one of the amazing things about Spanish records, at least in Puerto Rico, and I think in many other Spanish-speaking countries, is that oftentimes a birth certificate or a baptismal certificate will list not only the parents, their race, fascinating here, she's listed as mestiza. It will also list the grandparents. And if the grandparents are known on the mother's side as well as the father's side, it'll list them. If there's a section on the ones in Puerto Rico, at least, for additional information. So sometimes if there are older siblings, then they might also be listed. Or if a parent has died, they'll be listed. That'll be noted there. Or if the mother is a widow, that'll be listed. So much information on a birth certificate in Puerto Rico versus what you might find in the States, which will often just list, when they were born, where they were born, and the parents, and that's kind of it. Sometimes race, but not anything besides that.
And your dad says that this will not be the case with her birth certificate, but if you're searching for birth records in Puerto Rico, sometimes they don't match the date of the actual birth because they took a while to record births because so many babies died so young.
That's right. There was a cholera epidemic at one point, and Bobby was saying that they kind of waited it to make sure that child would live to register the birth in some cases. And so that there is a disappearance of babies who did not live very long. As well as those who lived, then the recognition of their birth would have just taken longer within the registry. But for me, it's really interesting that her birth day is consistent no matter the source. When she's talking about her birthday, when the birth certificate is, what's interesting to me is that she shaved off a year in her own interview with me.
My mother did that too.
Right.
So
I don't know what's
up with that.
I don't know.
They shaved off a year.
I don't know. But her birth certificate is super interesting too because this piece around race. So in Puerto Rico, depending on the year, race can be listed as blanco, de color, mulatto, negro. Mestiza is a very particular notation, which generally indicates it's supposed to indicate a connection with an indigenous heritage, indigeneity, as well as being white and a mix of cultures. Sometimes that term is actually used as a way of erasing blackness, and so saying indigenous, but actually meaning that someone in the family was of African descent. So it's a toss-up as to what it actually means. What was interesting to me in finding this in her birth certificate was that I looked at a cousin from her mother's side, and she also had mestiza listed within her birth certificate. It's not consistent across all the different folks in her family, so I'm not sure about that. But our family does, through DNA alone, have an indigenous heritage specifically located within the Caribbean, within Puerto Rico in particular. And so I think that line may have come through her mother's side. I haven't figured it out yet, but this is a question that I'm holding. And another thing that she also noted was that down the line, some of her people came from the Canary Islands. And I haven't found all of that history yet, but I'm pretty sure that it came from her mother's side as well. that there is a point in the 1800s where I can't go any further. And I think that that might be because those records before 1898 were actually held within Spanish records, and I haven't figured out how to search them as yet, although they are available online. So for those of you who are exploring records before 1898 and your country of or your community of origin had a colonial relationship with Spain, then a lot of Spain's records actually online too and searchable if you know where to look. And I'm still figuring out those search terms.
And I don't know why I remember the descriptor of the folks from Spain as being Spanish aristocracy.
Yeah. Oh, I don't remember that. So
well, I remember that. Don't ask me. It's, when you're doing these podcasts, all these memories come up, and I remember that descriptor for the folks from Spain.
That's fantastic. I don't remember that part of the story, and I love that, and that'll lend itself to looking up some other things. So some other features about my grandmother, which are fascinating, is that we were doing this interview with my Titi Vilma, and one of the questions that I asked was, how did my grandparents meet? And she was saying that they are related. They're like second cousins through the Adornos. Trujillo Alto was very, very small. It still is very small in Puerto Rico, and like lots of people. It's a small community. So anyway, how did they meet? Well, Titi Vilma was saying, Daddy Ning's grandmother was possibly the sister of Mami Juanita's grandfather, and that grandmother was kind of on the outs. And when he was visiting his grandmother, he happened to see Mami Juanita, and in the story, she's cleaning clothes in the river, and he falls in love by looking at her in the river. In her story, because I asked her this in 2003, and so it's so important to find this, she says that they had an incredibly beautiful love, and it began by meeting at a Saints' Day celebration. So I'm curious about how the stories changed from person to person, but there was definitely some meaning and a pretty instantaneous love. What do you remember from Titi Vilma about how their relationship? I think that might be fruitful.
Well, I guess I would just say that my mother-in-law was this incredible person who had to bear a lot of stuff on her own because my father-in-law was the merchant seaman, and so she came to the States with and eventually had all these children. But for much of her existence, he wasn't here.
Yeah, 6 months away.
And again, she had to negotiate this on her own by herself with probably her children interpreting. There were family in New York and family in Philadelphia, but my impression is that they were not always very helpful.
Yeah.
And so she had to negotiate welfare systems. There was some story about her going to the welfare office, needing assistance, and them not giving it to her. And she said, okay, well, then you take care of all these kids.
And walked out.
And so my mother-in-law was amazing that she could be able to do this all the time, keeping her religion and her faith and making sure everybody was connected. Her children went to Catholic schools. I'm not sure how she negotiated that because that's an expense. I know my husband went to Roman in Philadelphia. So she was just an amazing person, and they stayed together all those years through very difficult situations. She helped raise 2 children that were his children by someone else. And so she not only raised her 6, but she raised during periods of time 8. Mm-hmm. And as my husband said, all of us graduated from high school and nobody ever went to jail.
Yeah. Significant. Well, and she made strong choices. So there was a story of one of my uncles starting to say, I want to study. This was when they lived in New York, but I'm being pursued by the gangs here, and I don't want to be in a gang. And even talking with Titi Vilma of like, and there had been a nephew who died through being caught up in gang violence, and Mami Juanita making a choice at that time to uproot her family. And they had strong, deep connections in New York. And New York is super like diverse, and a lot of Spanish speaking community and family and friends and everything. She uprooted the whole family, and they moved to Philadelphia. My great grandfather was here. There was family here. But part of what was informing that decision was, I don't want to lose my son, and I can bring my family to a space of safety. And she didn't love Philadelphia. She said it herself in that interview from 2003. She didn't like it initially herself, and missed her community in New York, loved being there, but it was better for the family ultimately. And then after, decades and decades, it was her growing into finding her place in an entirely new community, an entirely new city, where she herself did not have the roots that her husband, my grandfather, did. So
and when you talk about their relationship, she was very clear that when he died, there would just be nobody else ever in her life again.
Yeah, she
wore. In fact, for a year, she wore almost a monk's robe, and very deliberate. She was just very clear that there would never be anybody else in her life.
Yeah, and I think that's significant too. And talking with Titi Vilma and learning about that evening, serenading her in Puerto Rico, and writing all these songs for her, and the love that they had being, so long.
Yeah, because we found out he could sing. I didn't know he could sing.
We didn't know that. We didn't know that.
I never heard that.
And so all these discoveries and talking with family members, illuminating her even more closely. So I appreciate the remembrances, what she also gave us. So I wanted to start with that prayer around faith because she was so faithful. And one of the gifts that Titi Vilma gave me when we were at her novena, so a novena is 9 days of prayers that happen usually at the home of the deceased to shepherd their soul into the hereafter. And so the family gathers and prays together. And so when my grandmother transitioned, we had a novena at her home. And in that first day that we were there, Titi Vilma, or I think it was them, that she had told, yes, it was, when she was talking about how my grandmother had, when she was taking care of us, would often talk about how we slept together, how we napped together, me and my brother, one on one side, one on the other, and she would read to us the Bible and sing, sacred songs. And it wasn't until she had told me that I remembered that so vividly. I remembered her scent. I remembered the evening practice or the afternoon practice of resting with her. And found that in the novena, there were so many prayers and so many songs that I remembered even from that time, the melodies. I didn't remember the words per se, but the melodies that she had given us as children in the rhythm of her voice. And so it was this wonderful recollection of the past and the feeling of her presence, even in that prayer for her soul's transition. So this process of interviewing is so important, and remembering. And as we close today, I hope that us sharing about my grandmother, Mami Juanita, often I called her Mommy as well, helps you to think about your people, your grandmothers, your grandfathers, your peoples of lineage that perhaps you have chosen to be in that role of other mother or other father, if you will. And Mommy, are there any things that people should hold as they think about methods for discovering more?
Well, I don't know about methods. I just wanted to add that she was very supportive of me and my family. I don't know how we could have made it if she wasn't taking care of my children for a very long period of time. She was so upset when we put Raina in school. She thought we were taking Raina away from her. And I kept saying, but Raina wants to go to school. She wants to go to school.
My brother would have stayed.
My brother said that your
son.
Oh, my son, because he acts like my brother. But my son he would have been fine to stay at Mami Juanita's house for the rest of his life, but Raina wanted to go to school, and she loved taking care of not only my children, but everyone else's children too. So she was mother to a whole bunch of her grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when she transitioned, it was really like losing my mother all over again. So I was really, really close to her, and like everyone else, do miss her greatly.
And I'll offer one last thing. Going back to the interview, and I do think, again, when you interview, do the transcription, go back to them, read them again. There was one piece where I was talking to her. This was an interview that I actually did in 2014, just a few months before she died. And I was talking about being a professor. And she was so proud. I had forgotten that moment of the interview where she was like, oh, so what are you doing now? And I said that I was a professor of teachers, that I was teaching them how to be educators. And she was like, so you must know a lot to do that. And I was like, well, I know a little bit. And we both were chuckling in the recording of her pride, but also me being affirmed in what I did know. And this extending from her own pride of, yes, my children graduated from all my children graduated from high school. And this has led to my grandchildren having an education. And I myself started from very little. In the recording, she talks about having in one instance, she talks about having like a first grade education. In another, she talks about having more of an 8th grade education. So I don't know how things transitioned over time, but elementary school was when she was a limit of what she had, formal education, and yet she was a constant reader of the Bible, and obviously emphasized education within the home, and that leading to a lot of us dedicating good effort to learning more and more and more and sharing what we did. So she was a force. And I offer you all those stories, y'all, and all the methods, and I hope that it leads you to finding out more about your people and more about yourself. So if you like this podcast, or this episode, as well as the podcast, subscribe. We are on all the places: Spotify, Audible, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere. We're even on the YouTube. So like and subscribe and share the news with others and comment.
And please subscribe on the podcast methods where you get your podcast, because we are trying to grow our subscription base, and we do have a contest during April and May. So, let us know that you've subscribed and you might win a prize.
Excellent. And you can email us your information about subscribing, as well as your questions, to storyjoyinc@gmail.com. That's storyjoyinc, STORYJOYINC@gmail.com. And as much as we can, we will respond to questions and support you in your own journeys. Perhaps we might be able to push you in the right direction. So thank you all for listening, and until next time.
Bye-bye.
Es una vida buena, una vida que no me puedo quejar, y estoy contenta porque tengo una familia bien buena. Yo me llevo con todo el mundo, vivo en Estados Unidos bien contenta de que vine aquí, siempre nunca ha tenido desacuerdo con nadie, ha vivido mi vida, siempre ha sido una persona de la casa. Yo no sé lo que es coger un cigarrillo en mi boca, no sé lo que es beber cerveza, no sé lo que de nada, solamente yo me dediqué a hacer una familia doméstica, una familia buena, como mi papá y mi madre me enseñaron a mí. Uh-huh. Y le doy gracias a Dios porque donde quiera que yo vaya, no tengo dificultad de caminar en Estados Unidos. Uh-huh. Porque a pesar de todo que soy puertorriqueña, pero me ha portado bien en Estados Unidos. Uh-huh. Y no tengo, vivo contenta, soy feliz. Y yo creo que si todo el mundo pensara así, estuviéramos cada día dando más progreso para que Estados Unidos eche hacia adelante y que vengan más gente para ayudarles, y también Puerto Rico, vivir una vida como tenemos que vivirla, una vida de amor, de paz, y llevarnos uno a los otros, sin tener, siempre hay dificultades, pero evitarlas de uno no hacerlas. ¿Entiendes? Eso es lo que yo me siento así. Pero no es porque quiero ser mejor que nadie, yo soy una persona muy humilde, sencilla, me conformo con lo que tengo, no deseo nada de nadie, pues yo creo que si yo sé de muchísima gente así, especialmente la pobreza. La pobreza después que tú le compartas con ellos, se sienten contentos, felices. Dice, ay, mira qué persona más caballera, mira qué persona más buena, mira qué persona me regaló este traje, me regaló estos zapatos, o me regaló, yo estaba pasando y esa persona estaba dando una compra y me dio a mí un paquete de pan. Pues uno se siente contento, le da gracias a Dios. Ajá. Eso es lo que siempre yo he pensado así. Y si mucha gente pensaran así, pues creo que echamos más para adelante. Y hoy hay mucha oportunidad porque hay muchas universidades, muchos colegios que enseñan especialmente los pobres, que hay pobres que en verdad no tienen nada. Y la misma universidad se dan cuenta, los maestros, y ven que trabaja y dice, bueno, vamos a ayudar a ese pobre, que se ve que puede hacer algo. Entonces cuando le dan una educación, sí, quizá el gobierno pague. Y si uno viene pagando poquitito, y a veces no tiene que pagar, porque el gobierno entra para que esa niña o ese niño tenga una oportunidad de echar hacia arriba, y que le viene a dar una oportunidad a Estados Unidos, para que Estados Unidos haga más negocio, más vida, y sigue ayudando. Cuando se ve que ayudan, siguen ayudando a la pobreza. Y muchos pobres que hoy hay, abogados, jueces, doctores, que no tenían nada, pero el gobierno le dio una oportunidad. Este país de oportunidad, y el que coge la oportunidad lo hace, pero el que no la coge no lo hace, porque uno mismo tiene que empujarse. Y a veces las personas dicen, yo no voy porque no me atrevo. No, yo he ido a sitios, ¿verdad?, que en verdad ha ido a partes que yo misma me da cuenta, yo sé que voy a pedir una ayuda, y por la obediencia mía siempre me ha ayudado. Siempre me ha ayudado, porque yo voy y digo la verdad. Entonces la persona dice, cuando esta señora viene a pedirle esto, o que le ayuden con esto, vamos a ayudarle. Entonces el gobierno viene y le ayuda a uno, usted sabe, le ayuda. No toda la vida, pero le puede ayudar en unos años, hasta que esa persona eche hacia adelante. Y así el país sigue. Entonces la pobreza va disminuyendo, se va sintiendo mejor. ¿Entiendes? Eso es lo que yo creo de Estados Unidos. Un país de progreso, un país de hacia adelante. Porque yo conozco pobres que han venido a Puerto Rico y aquí tienen negocios grandes. Especialmente conozco aquí una familia que se llama Sánchez. Ese señor vino de Puerto Rico bien pobre. Y aquí en este país muchos hispanos pobres se han hecho de ricos.